Okay, good morning, everyone. I'm Dennis Sikowski. I think I know most of you in the room, but I'm the science director here at the Hudson River Foundation, and I'd just like to welcome you to our sort of next to the last spring First Tuesday seminar. We're doing this live, and we're doing this by webinar, and those are the folks on the webinar. I want to welcome all of you. I think most of the names that I saw listed, you've probably done this before, but let me just go over some of the ground rules of our seminar. Is that hopefully all of you online can see us and hear us and see the presentation. If not, you can put in your little chat column, and we've got somebody monitoring the situation. We can hear from you in writing at the end of the seminar. If you have any questions, we would love to have your questions put to Phil, and you can write them in, and we'll make sure that we get all of them. For those of you, we have a sign-in sheet that we'll pass around again. If you could just check your name off if you've reserved a spot here today. If you have not, please put your name and address so we can stay in touch with you, particularly through email. Today, we're fortunate to have a nice big audience coming here. We told Phil that he is the star, certainly not the topic. Everyone's come to hear what Phil has to say. But we're pleased to have Phil Orton, who's a research scientist at Stevens Institute of Technology. By background, Phil is a physical oceanographer. He has a real interest in modeling and has done quite a bit of work since Sandy, which has made him kind of a prominent person to consult with. I think he's consulting with you folks in New York City planning, with the New York City panel on climate change. I think Phil's involved with a rebuild by design project, and kind of a useful individual. We work with Phil here at the Foundation on projects like Harico's Hudson River Environmental Conditions Observing System. So Phil's not a stranger here, and we're also proud that a number of years ago we were able to fund part of his doctoral research through graduate fellowship. So Phil has agreed to come and chat with us about storm surge, and the title of his topic is Modeling New York, New Jersey Harbor Storm Surge Flooding and Influences of Barriers in Natural Systems. Phil Orton.
Thanks, Dennis. So my co-conspirators are Nikitas Georgis, Sergei Vinogradov, Alan Blumberg, all at Stevens Institute, and funding from a variety of sources, but NOAA and NASA have been good to us, and also we do a lot of computer modeling at CUNY's High Performance Computing Center. They're a really helpful collaborator of ours. So thanks for coming out today, and I'm going to talk about storm surge flooding in New York, New Jersey Harbor region and our modeling, and also the influence of the barriers and natural systems. So here's sort of an outline, a timeline. First I'll talk about just our efforts to capture Hurricane Sandy with our model simulations and comparing them to observations. Sort of just showing what we do, sort of our bread and butter at Stevens Institute with our research group. And also to because then I'm going to also be using models to analyze hurricane storm surges for the rest of the talk. So then I'll also talk about observations, however. Part two, we just had a paper accepted to a journal on that looks at the historical perspective back to pretty much doubling the historical measurements we have available to the public for storm tides all the way back to 1844 for New York Harbor, and showing that the storm tides have been growing. Ignoring sea level rise, they've also been growing. Like the 10-year storm tide's been growing. And then I'll talk about green shorelines for coastal risk reduction, some positives, some negatives, and also positives and negative aspects of storm surge barriers and berms. And actually I'll close by talking about our Rebuild by Design project and its philosophy of resilience. Okay, so just a quick reminder of Sandy storm track for our modeling that we did. People have seen that enough, I think. But Sandy, by the numbers, Sandy was the highest flood elevations in the whole history of New York City and New Amsterdam, to our knowledge, although there's less information back to the 1700s. But the 1800s, we had pretty good information. And it beat the storm tide of Irene by 4.6 feet, so a dramatic surprise for people. A little reminder that we can have the high end on our storm tides, which I'll talk about a little bit later, is almost without a ceiling, because we could have a Category 5 hurricane. It might be a 1 in 10,000 year event or something, but we can have big surprises. We estimate that the hurricane of 1821 had a 12 to 13 foot flood level, or storm tide actually, but it had lower sea levels by about 1.5 feet, so it's quite a bit lower than Sandy. That's our current estimate, and we're studying the 1821 storm. I'll show a little bit on that today. But there's not very good information from 1821, not as much detailed information. And lastly, the flood elevation at Kings Point was 14 feet, a few hours after the peak at the Battery on October 29th, 2012. And the peak storm surge was 12 feet, whereas at the Battery it was 9.4 feet. But it came near low tide, and that was very fortunate. And I'm also going to talk about what if Sandy came at a different time and came at high tide in Long Island Sound. So here's our tools that we have. What's existed for a long time is this NIHOPS domain. Stevens Estuary and Coastal Ocean Model, CCOM, is our model. It's a computer code that we use that imposes conservation of momentum, conservation of water mass, salt, temperature. It imposes these conservation principles as equations, and they're solved over time over an entire grid. So the grid is, this large-scale grid is 300 by 300, so it's about 5-kilometer pieces of ocean, and it's got vertical layering, also 10 layers in the vertical. So we basically discretize the ocean into these pieces and apply forces like the wind stressing on the sea surface, or a sea surface slope would lead to pressure pushing the water to try to equalize. So these different forces are applied through this model. So it's basically the best available science, our pretty good knowledge of ocean, of hydrodynamics, the science of forces impacting movement of water, are imposed on this grid. So, and then the existing grid that we've used the most in the past that you might have seen before is for our NIHOPS, New York Harbor Observing and Prediction System domain, shown here from Maryland to Cape Cod, sort of focused in with its highest resolution, and New York Harbor shown down here, about 100-meter resolution is typical. And then my first grid that I made 3 years ago when I started working at Stevens and became an ocean modeler is the SNAP grid, shown here, Stevens Northwest Atlantic Predictions. And the reason we did that was because we used to receive sea level estimates from a NOAA model at this offshore boundary for our domain. And when you have storms like Sandy and Irene that are so huge, you really want to model the whole area and not rely on NOAA's forecasting system to give you those estimates. So it gave us more control over our modeling. So now we have this large-scale ocean model domain all the way out to the end of Nova Scotia. And just show some quick results on Hurricane Sandy and what happened. So here's Sandy approaching from the south. This is just a storm surge simulation. There's no tides in this large-scale grid typically. We impose those on the continental shelf, the coastal grid, the NIHOPS grid. So first slide. So you might see that there's a slight elevation of water due to inverse barometer effect. So the low pressure versus the high pressure at further distances. These are isobars of pressure. So 1010 is sort of a normal atmospheric pressure. 980 is a low pressure down here. So lower pressure, it's basically the water moves from the high pressure area where the atmosphere is pushing down harder to the low pressure area. It's called inverse barometer effect. And these arrows are the winds. So hurricane strength wind is 33 meters per second or above. That's 74 miles per hour. And so the arrows are scaled to the wind speed. And so there's just this red line is showing where we are in the animation. So here's Sandy and its pressure-driven bulge moving up toward New Jersey landfall, and the wind's wrapping around it. One thing you'll notice, Earth's rotation is actually having a big effect. That pushes water to the right of the winds. So if you're just pushing water downwind, you wouldn't have this high sea level in New York Bight and along the New Jersey coast, because there were northeast winds, even northeast winds during, for 3 days preceding the landfall of Sandy. So Earth's rotation had a really big impact, driving up sea levels for this whole period in the days. So this is storm surge. This is the anomaly from wind and pressure-driven anomaly from mean sea level here, and it was rising for days before landfall of Sandy, because these northeast winds, like you get in a nor'easter, are driving water to the right because of Earth's rotation, because of the Coriolis effect.
Your arrows, wind or water?
The arrows are wind, not water. So there's your hurricane strength wind right there. So if it's that length of an arrow, then you have a 74 mile per hour wind speed. So you have a lot of these, according to this meteorological assessment that we're using to force our ocean model, and that's what you're seeing here. It's not observed wind, it's a reassessment of what the winds were, a best estimate of the wind fields were over the region from a company called Ocean Weather. So next slide. So now you really see these northeast winds. I mean, they're not blowing water to the south, they're blowing water to the west. So that's that Coriolis effect. And finally, landfall and our peak storm surge was close to 10 feet during Sandy. So, but then with the storm tide, okay, and then the winds turn out of the south and wind actually being moved offshore, not up into New York Harbor again due to Coriolis effect. So it has, Earth's rotation has a real big, surprising influence on the movement of water. Okay, and then our Nighthawk domain, where we have tides imposed at this offshore boundary, tide plus the sea level anomaly from the last model simulation I showed you, get imposed on the boundaries of this domain. So just stepping through, one thing you see is low tide at New York Harbor is not really low tide in Long Island Sound. They have very different tide phase. So there you go again. So it switches to low tide in Long Island Sound. It's sort of a medium tide in New York Harbor. This is the battery water elevation shown at the top right. And then there's those northeast winds, sea level rising, peak flood height. Actually, this flood height right here was about Irene's flood height at the high tide the morning of Sandy's landfall on the 29th. We already had a flood height similar to the height of Irene. And so people like me were on TV trying to get the message out and say this is going to be many feet higher than Irene. And unfortunately, people just didn't understand what a 6 to 11 foot storm surge was, and a lot of people didn't evacuate. So message didn't get out from NOAA by any means, and the weather forecasters didn't even really understand what the forecast of 6 to 11 foot storm surge was. So really the message just didn't get out, and that was a huge fault before Sandy. Also, our forecasts and forecasts in general were too low for Sandy, and there's multiple reasons for that. I could talk about later if people want to talk about that. So what I'm showing you here is a reanalysis or a hindcast of Sandy that's very accurate because we have a major factor was we didn't have very good weather forecast forcing our ocean model. And so when we use the best weather data available, the reassessment of what the winds and pressure were, we do much better. And so here's that peak flood height for Sandy. So it was above mean sea level, it was about 11.5 feet or 3.5 meters at New York Harbor at the battery. Okay, and just a quick assessment of our modeling. As you can see, something like 15 centimeter. These are root mean squared errors at different places around the region. So it's something like a 15 centimeter typical root mean square error on the predictions. Something really wrong at Atlantic City, I think, because waves complicate. Our model doesn't have all the capabilities having to do with waves pushing up sea level and the complexity that the beaches have isn't being captured maybe with Atlantic City. Also, it could also be, from a modeler's perspective, it might be that the gauge is wrong. But and it could be. It's very complicated because you have big sea level gradients at the beach. The mean sea level at the end of a pier might be a lot lower. That might be what's going on there than at the shore because of the wave breaking. But I think we know we need to improve our model when it comes to waves, so it's probably a problem with our model. And as everyone knows, there's a lot of water in a lot of low-lying neighborhoods. That's South Street Seaport, about 7 foot deep, just behind the waterfront. Most of these neighborhoods are, the neighborhoods that have the deepest flooding are usually former wetland areas. I hope to include a plot from Eric Sanderson that shows the evacuation zones on one side and the former wetland areas on the other that have been filled historically, and they pretty much overlie each other really well. Okay, so next of my 4 parts of the talk, talking about the historical perspective on storm tides in New York Harbor. So there's been, as I mentioned, and I'll briefly discuss, there was a hurricane similar to Sandy's flood height back in 1821, and this is an estimated storm track, which it may have actually been further offshore, but it was a Category 3 hurricane, so maximum wind speed about 108 miles an hour. There's newspaper accounts that have become almost become accepted fact that say the water rose 13 feet in 1 hour, whereas Sandy rose about 2 feet per hour. So if that's true, then that's very violent and deadly. So we've been trying to figure out if that could have really happened. You would need a tide bore or something to do that, I think. It's more like a tsunami than a normal storm surge. So, I mean, one message from this is don't just prepare for the next Sandy. You could have 100-mile-an-hour winds. Here's the just one clip from our model simulation of the hurricane of 1821 with our CCOM model. And these are 100-mile-an-hour winds shown here. It's a lower flood, but having 13 feet in 1 hour and 100-mile-an-hour winds, if that's all true, could be very devastating. Our modeling suggests the waters didn't rise that fast, and I think we've become skeptical of the newspaper accounts, their accuracy, and so we're going to hopefully revisit that in a paper that we're looking to publish in the next year. One other thing, which is actually just accepted to a journal, I can pass on to people if they give me their contact information. A collaborator, Stefan Talk, he's been scanning tide data handwritten tide data from the National Archives back to 1844. And so from places like the Brooklyn Tide Gauge House, where the ferry used to leave to Staten Island over here, and from other sites all around New York Harbor, shown here, different locations for the battery tide gauge, etc., we've extended the annual maximum flood height estimate data set shown here. So these are just all annual maxima, all the way back to 1844. And I mean, the main punchline here, so these are each an annual maximum. We don't have all the tide data, the hourly tide data for the whole period. It would take a lot more time to scan every page of these notebooks. But we feel like we have a pretty good data set going back to 1844. And the main conclusion is that, as you can see here, there really weren't very high floods. This is the height of the battery seawall here, that dashed line. Down here we have the height of, it's just sort of a nominal Manhattan, maybe older seawall's height of 1.75 meters. You can really see, just looking at this time series, that flood heights have gotten worse. More routinely, you're getting up to that 1.9 meter height. And of course, Sandy is an extreme event, and that's kind of more random. But these 10-year floods, and as quantified here, this is a 10-year return period assessment. So this has no sea level rise. Sea level rise is taken out of this plot, by the way, at the top. It has nothing to do with sea level rise. We're seeing bigger storm tides. And this shows a 10-year, running 37-year assessment of the 10-year flood height. So you have some uncertainty. That's this pink area shading. But the red line is showing that height of a 10-year estimated flood, and the blue line of a 5-year estimated flood from this 37-year running window of an assessment back all the way to the 1840s. And you see that it's grown about 28 centimeters, the red line. The height of a 10-year storm tide, 10-year return period, has grown by about 28 centimeters. With combined over here on the right with 44 centimeters of sea level rise, you end up having a very big, you reduce your probability of overtopping this 1.75 meter flood height. You go from about a 1% chance per year in the 1800s to a 25% chance per year now. So it's a very much higher risk of flooding now in New York City for these sort of moderate, 10-year flood events. And so we're not sure why this is. It could be climate variability, maybe emergence, something that happened way back here, and maybe more gradually in the early 1900s seems to have made flooding worse. And so it could also be climate change, global warming. It could, we think it's most likely human changes made to the harbor, such as elimination of wetlands, dredging channels. The initial dredging of a shallow channel has a very big impact. Deepening a channel like Arthur Kill doesn't have as big of an impact once the channel's already deep. But so, I'd definitely be interested to hear from people what they think happened to the harbor over, this period, in case it could explain this. And we actually have applied for NSF funding to study this in a lot more detail. Okay, so the next half of my talk is on how do you protect or reduce risk from flooding. First on green shorelines. So adaptation option number one to think about is the green shoreline type approach. So and some of the ideas that we've looked at are restoring wetlands and islands, such as has already been done in Jamaica Bay to a smaller extent and could be ramped up a lot by the Corps of Engineers. And the way that this works is the flow experiences a lot more friction if the flow is going through wetland grasses, or even oyster beds and things also add more friction than a smooth, muddy seabed. And the idea of shallowing, reversing dredging or shallowing a deep shipping channel that's no longer used anymore, that also sort of adds friction. When you have very shallow water, you have a lot more turbulence, and it's harder to move water through a shallow channel than it is through a deep channel. And so you get a lot less water penetrating into a neighborhood if you can shallow deep channels. So, and this isn't, with Jamaica Bay, so there is a rule of thumb, which I think is very rough and it shouldn't be used, but it sort of gets the point across. That is that for every 2.7 miles that a storm surge or a flood flows over a wetland, you reduce the flood height by a foot. So it's really not very encouraging when you think of protecting Manhattan from a storm surge, because we need our deep channels into Manhattan, into New Jersey's ports at Elizabeth and Newark. So it's not very promising for protecting shorefronts with seagrasses. But when you think of Jamaica Bay, it has about a 10-kilometer area that water has to pass through to get to all these neighborhoods on the northern part of Jamaica Bay, like Howard Beach. And also historically, it was much shallower of a bay, typical depth about 1 meter, and also had a lot more wetlands. So it could be seen as sort of a restoration. There's not a lot of shipping into Jamaica Bay now, although there is important shipping still today, but maybe not in 50 years. So it's sort of an opportunity to think what might the future Jamaica Bay look like. So the volume of the bay has increased dramatically, about 350% since the 1800s, and the average depth has gone from 1 meter to about 5 meters in the bay. So dramatic increases in depth. The tides, as a result, the tides in the bay have increased. There's a paper by Larry Swanson and Bob Wilson, 2008. They show how the high water levels have increased a lot, and this may also be a part of the reason why the wetlands are disappearing, because they're underwater for a longer time during high tides. And of course, if the high tides are bigger, then how about the storm surges? So you can expect storm surges are bigger also. So, and that's what this is all about. So just a very gross, sort of unrealistic experiment, not something we would propose doing anytime soon, but maybe something that shows us the leverage you have on storm tides for Jamaica Bay. For this experiment, I shallowed the bay down to 2 meters for the whole bay and out through Rockaway Channel. And so these are some older results from a year and a half ago using our CCOM model, but I'm also going to show you ADCERT model results from the model that FEMA uses for their flood mapping, for their flood assessment. So first, with our model, looking at the 1821 hurricane, the red line is the control where there's no change to Jamaica Bay. It's today's modern day bathymetry. The blue line is the shallow bathymetry on the left. And on the right, it's shallow bathymetry, flooding and tides, when you also have more roughness. It's a very simplistic way of representing wetlands and oysters and things, but the whole bay has a higher roughness, which also impedes flow. So, and then on the bottom, you see Hurricane Sandy. So with the Hurricane 1821, it's this very fast, abrupt storm surge from a Category 3 storm that whizzes by and gives you maybe 4 hours of very strong 100-mile-an-hour onshore winds. So that friction really helps reduce the flooding dramatically, 3 or 4 feet in these cases, or a meter or more. And with Sandy, there's less of an impact according to our model, but you still can have reductions of maybe 1 or 2 feet for Hurricane Sandy flooding. If you have shallower, dramatically shallow channel, and then in the cases on the right, also roughness from wetlands and oyster beds. So as part of, so I was an advisor to the New York City study, A Stronger, More Resilient New York, otherwise known as the Special Initiative on Rebuilding and Resilience, and we ran some model runs with ADCERT, a different flood model. So I'm going to show those, and these are a lot more detailed, higher resolution. So one set of experiments has a berm over Rockaway Peninsula. It has wetlands, elevated, sort of extreme case again of wetland restoration throughout the bay. And also there's some, you should ignore in these experiments, there's also some changes to Coney Island, but the main focal point is Jamaica Bay here. And yet you still have this deep moat around the bay that's about 6 meters deep. So the results for flooding, so top left, with this particular study, we looked at Sandy plus 31 inches of sea level rise. So it's sort of Sandy plus sea level rise extreme case in the future. And so that's the control run of Jamaica Bay with very severe flooding. This is the modified bay where you have all the changes that I mentioned, including wetlands. So your total reduction in flood heights in the bay is, typically something more like 6 inches if you have all that wetland restoration. So this is a little bit disappointing. And the reason for it is because you have the deep moat around the bay, and it's basically just it's a pathway for the water to travel with very little friction around the wetlands. So they don't serve much purpose if you leave a deep shipping channel. And that's an important result for urban areas where you want to use wetlands to reduce flooding. If you still have deep channels that go right to the neighborhoods, like Howard Beach and these neighborhoods up here, then it may not reduce flooding very well. So then the other experiment we did was to shallow all these channels down to 2 meters. Again, it's a very extreme case, but we've also done experiments for rebuild by design where we only shallow, say, one channel like this one up here, and there's still pathways around the bay. So there's ways you can envision this. This is sort of like a leverage experiment to show how much at maximum you could reduce flooding. But you can also come up with creative ways to do something that's more realistic. And so this experiment had here's your control again, your modified bay flooding results. So you're reducing the flood heights by 3 to 4 feet. So you can really do a lot to reduce the flood heights by shallowing a deep shipping channel, as shown here. And also this includes the wetlands. So it's, you're basically forcing the water to go over the wetlands because you no longer have the deep moat around the bay. And so the last part of my talk on storm surge barriers and also kind of more broadly on berms or levees starts by thinking about storm surge barriers as have been proposed on Jamaica Bay, for example. And also in that special initiative on rebuilding and resilience report, there's 3 different storm surge barriers proposed to be studied. They're not proposed to be built anytime soon, but proposed to be studied and maybe built in the coming years. And these are just some examples, and barriers have been successful. They've prevented flooding to this point in the Netherlands, Providence, Stamford, Connecticut, New Bedford, the Thames in London. So they've been successful in a lot of places, and now there's also new ones in Venice and St. Petersburg. So it's a popular tool worldwide. Some benefits of storm surge barriers, one is efficiency. When you think of Jamaica Bay, if you can block the flooding at the entrance to Jamaica Bay out here with a storm surge barrier out here, it's a small place blocking the water. You may also need high berms on some low-lying land around it, but you don't have to protect the entire coastline on site, all the way around the bay. And that's a justifying factor that New York City was using to make the decision to consider the barrier at the entrance to Jamaica Bay as one of their top options. So that's one positive. Another one is, and I've been kind of thinking about this more deeply because I work in Hoboken. Hoboken doesn't really have any green solution by any means. It's a former island. It used to have wetlands around the back of it. 70% of it's in a flood zone, and then it has kind of a high ground area. So pretty much walls are just about your only option. So how do you, and we're also looking at Jersey City, which has similar issues, a little bit less extreme. So you can argue that cities are our greenest developments, low impact on climate, carbon emissions. They prevent sprawl. They prevent, if you have, right now, typically in urban areas, we get we're having a very small percentage of our people moving to cities like New York who live in the urban center, or where I used to live in Portland, it was a disappointingly small percentage. If there's not cheap housing in the city, then they move out into the sprawl. So you can argue that that's another justifying reason to protect these urban dense areas around harbors like New York City at all costs. And then the last argument for it that you hear a fair amount is that we could have the big one. So we need storm surge barriers because any day now we could have a 30-foot storm surge crashing over Brooklyn and Queens. And that was Doug Hill, who's one of the main proponents of storm surge barriers out, affiliated with Stony Brook. There's no, he's basically an opinion author in this particular paper, and there's no evidence there. I don't know what the evidence is of a 30-foot storm surge, and there's nothing I've ever seen that would suggest that's true. It's probably from a newspaper again. So we have to really view that sort of thing with skepticism. And also, if you do, we're not going to build a 30-foot storm surge barrier system. So you have to think, if we did get the 30-foot storm surge, what happens? So even if he's right, it might be a reason not to build storm surge barrier systems and tell people they're protected. So here's the proposed barrier system on Jamaica Bay, and it's definitely very effective and stops flooding entirely. If you have high berms in the right places, it makes a lot of sense. And so it's sort of an efficient, more cheap way to protect all the coastlines. But of course, there's big questions with water quality. And so we're involved in an effort to try to start doing water quality or improved water quality in Jamaica Bay. And so we can be part of the effort to evaluate this sort of thing. So now I'm going to talk more about the negatives of storm surge barriers and berms, which we really can quantify with these ocean models. We can really look at these things from a different perspective than anyone else, with more quantification, just like I did with the wetlands or channel shallowing. So one thing we did for New York City at the same time as the Special Initiative on Rebuilding and Resilience was we evaluated this alternative scenario. What if Sandy didn't hit at the time it did and have the storm surge peak at the time of high tide in New York Harbor? What if it hit earlier and had the peak storm surge in Long Island Sound at the time of high tide? And of course that would impact places like Hunts Point, Food Distribution Center, LaGuardia, some power plants. It would affect them a lot more. So New York City was really interested in this scenario. So the interesting thing is, the biggest thing that we realized during this was that if you just superimpose the storm surge on top of, the storm surge observed in Long Island Sound on top of a high tide in Long Island Sound, you would you'd beat the record flood height in Long Island Sound by a lot, just like we did in New York Harbor. You would overtop the Stamford storm surge barrier by more than a foot. So you would have had water pouring in to the neighborhoods. Now that's only with this sort of naive superposition of the surge that happened at low tide on top of a high tide. And so what we found when we did this hydrodynamic modeling is it's not nearly so dire. We found a negative 9-hour shift in the timing of Sandy was the peak water levels, and they would have risen to about 8 centimeters below the height of the storm surge barrier. But it's still like a real warning that hopefully people at Stanford, especially after we publish this paper in Journal of Extreme Events, hopefully they're paying attention to it. And they know that, and they're really not very high. Their barrier height is not much higher than the 1938 hurricane flood height. So if you're going to build these barriers only a foot higher than the storm that happened a few decades ago, it might, you really have to think about what's going to happen when you overtop the barrier. So, and here's just the time series showing the blue line you can sort of ignore. It's just the tides at Kings Point and at the Battery during Hurricane Sandy. It's just what the tide would have been, the astronomically driven tide alone. The actual observed Sandy is shown with the dashed line, and the Sandy as modeled, our best model at that time. We've actually improved on this with different weather forecast data, but our forecast or our model estimates, the dark green line, and then the shifted Sandy with it coming 9 hours earlier shown in red. So you have a decrease by a few feet in New York Harbor, so it wouldn't have stopped the flooding in New York Harbor, which it still would have flooded a lot of things. Maybe not, certain things wouldn't have flooded, but it still would have had pretty severe effects. But in Long Island Sound, you would have had a dramatically higher flood, as I mentioned. So we've been thinking about what happens, actually. It's not a far-fetched notion that you could build or raise up protections and have them overtop. So on Staten Island, it's not just a New Orleans problem. It happened on Staten Island. And I actually need, well, I'll get to that in a minute. So Staten Island, this is a story from WNYC where I helped put together some of the information and research. So the place where the most people died during Hurricane Sandy, 11 people drowned in this one neighborhood, Midland Beach, was a place where back in the 1950s, and this is where I would love to hear if someone has quantitative information, but supposedly they raised up the waterfront berm in the 1950s to prevent or reduce flooding, because there were a few very severe nor'easters in the early 1950s. They have a high, what they have here is the highest waterfront berm of the whole section of water of the shore there, higher than Oakwood Beach, and higher, I think, than points north. But it's a bowl-shaped neighborhood. So what we see, what we heard from people was that the water rose faster in that, rose very quickly in that neighborhood. And that's what this article talked about. It was a lot of people's perspectives on how dangerous it became when the water suddenly entered their neighborhood during Hurricane Sandy. And so we looked at this with the model, and we quantified the water rise rate. So normally you just hear about what the flood level is going to be, but we can look a little deeper and say, well, what are the dangers to people? A very slow 4-foot deep flood is not nearly as dangerous as a very fast 4-foot deep flood. So this is the water level rise rate, which was about 2 feet out offshore of Midland Beach, But as you can see here, it's something more like 6 feet per hour, and this may even underestimate. It might have happened in a shorter period of time in Midland Beach. And there's another place over here which is basically a wetland area. It's not inhabited. So it's the most dangerous place in the whole city according to this variable, and it's also the place where the most people, I think, per capita, easily up the highest number drown. So the big question there is, did Staten Island's waterfront berm, was it raised in the 1950s as was told in that story, and how so, and did it cause a more deadly flood? And also we've looked closer, and it's basically, here's that water rise rate again, just on a close-up. And when I look at the topography here, there's basically a protective, it's basically a little bowl. So it's just a warning in a way that we have to think a lot more carefully. If we're going to have bowls that are more than 6 feet below, depth, below the water, their protections, then people need to either evacuate, or you need to have some kind of better strategy, because it creates a more deadly hazard than you would have had if you didn't have the protections at all. So in this respect, it's kind of an important point, is that, here's a time series of what happened over a few hours. So the water rise rate offshore in blue, and the water rise rate in the neighborhood. So if you're at the beach, you would have had waves, so that's dangerous. But if you had something that blocks the waves, then you just had the mean water rise rate. It's much slower than in the quote protected neighborhood. So protections can become risk multipliers instead of risk reduction measures, and that's something that needs to be studied more and understood better. When the Corps of Engineers right now is looking at raising up those berms again along Staten Island by popular demand, because people really want to maintain their neighborhoods. Okay, so just some summary points on the barriers and natural flood protections. Storm surge barriers and levees or berms can protect the city center from storm surge flooding. They also can slightly worsen flooding outside the barriers. I didn't show that, but you definitely get, it's not a large rise in water levels, but for example, with the Jamaica Bay barrier, you have about a 2-inch rise in water levels throughout New York Harbor if you block off Jamaica Bay for Hurricane Donna. We haven't done an experiment with Hurricane Sandy. So you do, that might not be popular with New Jersey if New York City raises up all its defenses and they don't, or if New Jersey does and New York City does, then the rest of the Hudson, up the Hudson, they're going to have increased flooding problem. And then I think a really main point is we need to do better at developing risk reduction measures that don't, make risk worse in the rare case they get overtopped. So we're very good at protecting ourselves from minor disasters and moderate disasters. It's the same thing with forest fires and some other things too. We're good at protecting ourselves from the minor and the moderate, and we've got, protections in place in society, but those have been making the extreme event, when it arrives every 100 years, a lot worse. And that's happened with forest fires, and here I think it's what happened, it's what can happen with flooding also. So massive wetland restoration alone in Jamaica Bay only reduces the Sandy plus sea level rise flood levels by something like 6 inches, typical. But something that we haven't really looked at and quantified is wetlands likely do have wave and erosion reduction benefits in smaller storm events, which happen every 10 years or less. So that's something I didn't quantify, but it's likely true, so I don't want to speak as though wetlands don't help with flooding or with erosion. And last point, wetland restoration plus channel depth reductions, these dramatic sort of over-the-top channel depth reductions, they reduce Sandy's water levels by several feet, order of a meter, 3 or 4 feet. So that is a potential technique that could be used. It really needs to be studied more. Okay, so my last point is, my last couple slides are on our work that we did for Rebuild by Design. So it's somewhat informed by a lot of this research I just described. We had, so it was sort of approaches were designed all along the coastline from Great South Bay to Barnegat Bay, Raritan Bay, the Hudson, and just one study that got was the focal point was called Living Growing Breakwaters. For the past 3 months, this is what was chosen to go forward and dig to another layer of depth into it. So, and this was for Staten Island and Raritan Bay, and what's shown here is for Hurricane Donna in 1960, it's about a 50-year flood event. It was the record flood event before Sandy in the past 90 years. It's the wave heights, something like 5 or 6 feet at the shores along Staten Island. And when you have reefs along these areas, or breakwaters, which is what the design's looking at for rebuild by design, then you reduce the wave heights by a few feet at the shore. So it's not aiming to reduce the flood height and build walls. It's got these gappy reefs that just break the waves and reduce the danger and the erosion at the waterfront. And so talking about the whole SCAPE team, which is a very diverse team with educators, oyster growers, materials experts who are designing materials to help attract oysters, us physical oceanographers, and others, and consulting firms also. The strategy was to not just focus on risk reduction from physical approaches like these reefs, but also to focus on societal resilience by having people more involved with the water. And so if you have, and it had a very big educational aspect to it. So trying to get people more involved with the water, which was historically how Staten Island culture was. They were definitely a water culture, and historically they had oyster reefs offshore, which is another reason we're looking at this. So you not only improve, it's basically a layered approach where you reduce the risk of the waves, you reduce the wave heights, you may reduce the flood heights. You also increase the resiliency of the people. It's another layer. If people understand tides, if kids spend their lives a little more interacting with the water, if they know how to swim, then it's another layer of resilience to flooding. So having people more involved with the water instead of having a barrier of some sort is a way to go in that direction. So we're trying to think of solutions. It's kind of a tough problem. We're trying to innovate on solutions for these problems. So my final conclusions. First, we've successfully simulated Hurricane Sandy's storm tides with typical RMS error of about a half a foot or 15 centimeters. And so we've effectively captured Sandy, and we've got Sandy in a cage, and we can run experiments on Sandy. And it's a really valuable tool that we have now. With two different models, with our own model, and we're also trying to get a better simulation with AdCirc, which is what FEMA uses. We have a pretty good simulation with that different model. Storm tides in New York, New Jersey Harbor have worsened since the 1800s and the first half of the 1900s. We're trying to figure out why that is. Storm surge barriers and levees can be efficient means of protection, but are not always risk reduction measures. If they get overtopped, it's very important to understand what's going to happen when they get overtopped. Especially in an era of accelerating sea level rise, where we know that sea levels will eventually be coming up at a meter or more per century, and these protections may not be enough in 100 years. So they often create bowl-shaped neighborhoods, so may not be an appropriate solution in an era of accelerating sea level rise. And lastly, shallowing unused deep dredge channels could be an effective long-term green strategy for reducing flooding that really hasn't been studied much before. Thank you very much.
Okay, questions?
Great talk, and I saw something on what's it called, cyclone in the Philippines that recently all these people died and was on nature or something like that. In that instance, they actually had a videotape of this storm coming in, and it did behave a lot like this phenomenon. I wonder if you're familiar with that storm and what properties it had, and whether that type of event could come here, because the 13-foot 1820 storm, that's what the register being, that maybe was something along those lines.
Yeah, because we have cold water.
Can you repeat the question?
Yeah, so the question was, he was asking about the Philippines tropical cyclone that they had recently. There was a Category 5 storm, and basically, I also watched the video. It caused water flooding that came in over 5-10 minutes. The water rose, in tens of minutes it rose several feet. So it's and could we have something like that in New York City? And might that have happened in 1821 with the hurricane we had? And I mean, one positive is we have colder water off our coast, so we tend to. It seems very rare that very unlikely to get a Category 4 or 5. It's almost considered impossible, but probably possible, but it's exceptionally rare. So that helps us. But we could have a Category 3 or 4 storm hit, and you can have an abrupt flood if you have berms that get overtopped. You could have it if you have a large frictional area and you form a bore head. You can have a tidal bore or something. So that may be what happened there. I'm not sure what happened, but I was kind of, it's the kind of thing we really want to understand better. And these ocean models don't necessarily capture a borehead, something that's so nonlinear, as the focusing of water into a wall. You often hear about a wall of water hitting during a hurricane, and usually it's just it's a word that just sounds dramatic, and it definitely didn't happen. But I think there are times when it could happen. So that's something I think we really need to understand better.
Yes, I want to know about Linden, New Jersey. Was that the Achilles heel of the harbor where the storm flooded the refineries there and shut it down? And so we were unable to distribute gasoline to the community. Did you make any studies of Linden, New Jersey?
I know Hurricane Irene, I got a phone call from operator of one of those facilities, and they were very worried about it. Maybe Irene helped provide a warning, but I mean, they got, I think they got, a lot of the facilities got really heavily damaged, either by buoyancy, lifting things up and moving them, or losing electricity for several days. It was a real real weakness of our region in terms of resilience, right, and get the region getting back on its feet. So it's something that's being looked at in a lot of detail. I know New York City's study looked at energy as a whole chapter. They have a whole chapter on the energy system and on the food system, et cetera. There's all these things that we needed to think about more deeply and make sure that we're resilient to this sort of disaster.
Because they did dredge that harbor there 50, 55 feet or something.
That may have played a role. It's a good question. I don't know. For some of them, it probably does play a role that you have a very deep water passageway where it once didn't exist. But there's other places that are closer out to the open harbor and where it probably doesn't make as much of a difference. New York Harbor always was somewhat of a deep, maybe 20-foot deep passageways came into New York Harbor from the open ocean. So there's always been somewhat of a free flow of water coming in and out through the main up into the Hudson from Raritan Bay. But,
yeah, you touched on this briefly when you mentioned if New Jersey puts up walls, New York may not like it, or New York. What spatial scale do you think we should be looking at in terms of regional resilience?
the question is, what spatial scale should we be looking at in terms of regional protection or resilience? What spatial scale? I mean, you can argue, I've argued before we should focus on small-scale protections of individual critical infrastructure, like a power plant, or food facility like Hunts Point. So that's one thing that I think we should immediately be doing, and I think that's being done. The New York State just had a bill that passed, which is doing a lot of these small-scale protections for the transit system, for example.
If you look at specific locations, do you create the situation you described on Staten Island, where in thinking you're protecting, there are unintended consequences?
The unintended consequence of a small, protecting one city block that has a vital infrastructure is very small. Like I said, if you block the whole of Jamaica Bay off from water flow entirely when a storm's coming, you only get 2 inches increase out in the harbor. So, and that's a massive volume of water that's being kept out in the harbor that wants to go into Jamaica Bay. So usually the reflection of the surge, to some extent, it goes back out to sea. If you're not in an enclosed waterway like the Hudson or something, or the Mississippi River is the same way. When they have levees, they just push it somewhere else. But here we're on the open ocean, and a lot of that extra flooding ends up going back out to sea. So it's a smaller increase that you get. The unintended consequence of protection at one place is smaller than you might think. But if it's a large area, like a whole city or all of Manhattan or something, then it starts to become inches. It starts to make a difference elsewhere.
But we've got two questions. The second from the bottom. Why don't we take one of those first? Has anyone considered temporary barriers?
Okay, so Alan Springett online says, has anyone considered temporary barriers that would reduce channel depth to reduce overall flood impacts? So temporary barriers in the channel you could reduce the flow of water, sort of like friction would. If you have barriers that just reduce water flow, it's a good idea. I don't know that it has been considered, though. Definitely temporary barriers along waterfronts have been considered by New York City and Hoboken that could be deployed when a storm's coming and then taken back down. And they have their positives and negatives. There can be human error, and they might not install them correctly or something. But those are definitely being considered, too. The other online question is from John Woodruff, who gave a talk here a couple months ago, actually. With your assessment of oyster reefs off Staten Island, did you find similar results to wetlands in Jamaica Bay with respect to dredge channels having the primary control on surge? The oyster reefs off Staten Island don't stop the flood height. They don't slow or stop the water level, the mean water level at all. We purposely didn't attempt to do that, and we have spacing between them so water can travel around them. Even if you add a lot of oysters all in the whole region in front of Staten Island, what I found with a model experiment I did was that there's just such a wide area for the water to get there that it doesn't slow the water. It doesn't reduce the flood height. So it's really hard to reduce the flood heights with oysters or wetlands or anything in front of Staten Island because it's just so open to the water. So the water, as opposed to Jamaica Bay where there's this narrow inlet that comes in and the water has to travel along these channels over about 10 kilometers. So there's one narrow pathway. That's, I think, the key with Jamaica Bay, that the water has to follow that narrow pathway. Go ahead.
Yeah, I wondered if you could comment on the storm surge barrier that was built in New Orleans that evidently was pretty effective in stopping the surge from Isaac. And has it damaged the water quality or whatever there? That's number one. And number two, I thought that was really a good question about the spatial scale, because one thing I thought about the SIR report was that, you can't possibly really protect just New York City because of the economic interconnectedness of the whole region, and in fact, roughly half of insurance claims following a storm like Sandy are often business interruption, which is a function of supply chains, workforce, and things, and work stoppage. So that's, I think, a very good question. It seems to me that we really have to look at a regional scale to get protection.
True. And so that is a really tough question. What scale should we look at? And that's debated heavily. I have my own personal opinion, but there's good arguments for the efficiency of protecting the whole region, if you can, with an offshore barrier system. So, and on Isaac, I don't know as much about the storm surge protection system of New Orleans. It was effective. I think their goal is to protect against a 100-year flood down there. And
but with future climate change forecasts, so that's a big deal. If you look 50 years, you look at sea level rise, and also possibly storm characteristic changes. I think that's a very big deal. It's way more than the 1 in 100-year storm today. It's more like the 1 in 500 plus years.
So they're protected against that? You know more than I do.
So,
congrats.
So
that's good. That's good.
That seems to me an example of something that. But I wondered about the water quality impacts.
Yeah, I don't know about that. I know that. There's an argument like what they've done there is if you're going to build wall protections that are well above human height. There's plenty of neighborhoods in New Orleans where people the bowl-shaped neighborhoods well below 6 feet, down from the wall height. So then you need to really do it right and make it high and also make it extensible so that in 100 years you could add on to it.
Well, the lifetime
and then you're not.
Are only, they're not necessarily 100 years.
Yeah. So that's another way to think about it. Also, evacuations can be better. Although I think it's to me, it's clearly we're not learning about evacuation. It's not like something we need to learn. It's something emotional. People don't leave their homes. People don't want to leave their homes because of looting. They don't want to leave their homes because of comfort. It's a psychological thing. So it's not necessarily something we're going to learn in the next 100 years to leave your home and go to a shelter. So I'm not confident that we're ever going to suddenly learn how to evacuate. It's because it's a deeper psychological thing that needs to be done. But that would be a solution if we would always evacuate. Then when there's an overtopping chance, then it would be a good thing.
The economic loss.
Yeah.
Even if people evacuate, avoid that.
Yeah.
Which is, how many billions, 60 billion the government put in on top of 40 plus billion in insurance losses.
Right. Mm-hmm. Next.
Well, any plans to do a similar study on the Upper Harbor? I'm talking about that Jamaica Bay study that you did on shallowing to estimate the increased amount of surge that may have resulted from our used deep navigational channels. Is that something that your team has talked about or maybe might do?
It's something we can do without, with maybe days of work. It's not something we're funded to do. I've definitely looked at Arthur Kill in particular, or what is it, Kilvan? Which one's the long, narrow one? Kilvan Col. Looking at Kilvan Col, it's like, that's a very long but very deep dredge channel that doesn't have to be that way. I mean, but it's not, I haven't put much effort into that because I don't see it as being realistic. But we could do that. It's definitely something we can do, even if it's not something that could happen in the next 50 years. Maybe we'll move ports offshore in 50 years or something and have smaller boats that come into harbors, who knows. So it's something we could do, but we just don't have any plan to do right now.
It's just in the economic analysis of whether it makes sense to keep deepening those channels, it might be worth, in fact, if a modeling study show that we got an extra foot of surge out of those channels, that's a number, the damage that extra foot caused is a number that should be part of the calculation as to whether we want to keep going.
Yeah, I think there should be just based on what we're seeing, the complexity of what it takes to reduce storm surges and how there's some surprises sometimes, there should be an exhaustive study of the whole harbor to look at. You can also look at the meadowlands, for example. I did an experiment where I shallowed the channel going into the meadowlands, which is already shallowing on its own because it's not used. I've shallowed about 10 feet already, I think, from the last time it was dredged decades ago. And it actually reduced the flooding in Newark Bay, which is not what I would expect, because the water is being blocked from going up into the meadowlands by shallow frictional areas. But so there's some surprise, there's a lot more complexity than people would think to these questions. So it would be good to have a real exhaustive study of the whole region to quantify these things.
So after Sandy, the idea of a storm surge barrier from Sandy Hook to Rockland Point kind of raised its head again. Do you know if that's ever essentially been studied or modeled, something that extensive?
The question is, has the storm surge barrier from Sandy Hook to Rockaway Peninsula, the Gateway Plan it's called, I think, been studied in a lot of detail? It's been, there was an experiment during the Mayor's Special Initiative on Rebuilding and Resilience to look at, I think that's where it was. Was there?
Yes.
Yeah, that looked at how much it would increase flooding offshore, and it was very small, so that was one thing that was studied. And like I said, when you're out by the open ocean, if you block a storm surge, it kind of radiates back out to sea. It doesn't make dramatically higher flooding nearby. Whereas if you're in enclosed places like Long Island Sound, you see more effects, or an enclosed channel like the Hudson. So that's one thing I know has been done. There's a whole report, which I could forward someone if they want it, from 2 meetings really that have been on those topics in general, from an engineering association, I forget, the trade association, which I could get you in touch with. And so there have been some studies. I'm not sure how detailed they've gone into the Gateway Plan.
And did they look at cost as well, or just?
Yeah, it's something like $10 billion was their low end estimate. Yeah.
I actually have a book out. A book came out.
Yeah, that's the report on those. Yeah, so there's report booklets on 2 different meetings that look at storm surge barriers, which I could help you get. Go ahead, Mary.
Do beaches or nourished beaches pose the same sort of problem of being overtopped and then increasing the rate of water level behind there? And then did you see that at all in Coney Island with the Rockaways, where the beach is a little bit higher than the neighborhood behind that?
I think beaches, so I've wondered the same thing. When you have a berm on a beach, the dune,
Yeah.
is that a natural solution or is it a dangerous levee type solution?
Right.
I think what I'm learning is typically those just breach in one spot. They don't overtop catastrophically. If you have a levee that's all leveled at one height that's indestructible, at some point the water crests over it. And what happened in Midland Beach was it came in from 3 directions all at once, I think, to make the water rise really quickly. That's where it's much more dangerous. Whereas if you have dunes and beaches, they tend to be breached in narrow places, and the water rise rate isn't as deadly. Based on what I hear and what we see after these storms, they tend to not be as dangerous. So in a way, it's a less fragile kind of protection that maybe doesn't lead to a worsening of the hazard when it's destroyed, a dune system, because it just breaches, because it's flexible more, and it'll breach only in one narrow spot, and then the flood will come in more slowly. So it seems like a positive to me. Go ahead.
In your work, have you come across the effects of these storm surges and sea rises on the large facilities in Jamaica Bay, like the airport at JFK, the national park at the old Floyd Bennett Field, and the wastewater treatment plants, which are there's 26 Ward, and what else is it? Oh, and then the Rockaways have the power plant, and the surge up to Nassau. Have these major events, well, they've had effects on each of these facilities in different ways. Has anyone come up with some answers to, what it is and what it may mean?
Well, I'm certain New York City in their special initiative, report looked into this in a lot of detail, and I don't know all of what's been done. I know that New York City did pretty well. I believe the sewage treatment plants and such were fairly quick to come back online, which was a really big positive. And maybe that was due to concern about sea level rise and sort of thinking ahead. So I think New York City's facilities rebounded better than a lot of places, such as Freeport. They had a real bad problem with sewage treatment out there, I think, not coming back for a while. So, but I can forward you to the New York City Stronger, More Resilient New York report, which has chapters on a lot of these infrastructure topics.
There's a comment. I don't know whether you want to comment on a comment.
This one?
Yeah.
So Alan Springett's comment is deep channels also, Alan Springett's from FEMA, so he's in the know on these topics too, and we communicate a lot. So deep channels can also assist in removing surge. True, yeah. Miami Harbor found that the channel was actually deepened after Hurricane Andrew and not subject to either the expected surge heights or sedimentation. So if you have a deep channel and the water's trying to get out, then you're happy with the deep channel. Like in a river, if you're talking about river flooding and you shallow a channel, it's more likely to cause a higher flood. So that's a good point. It's that way with the Hudson River. If it were shallower or had more gravel on the bed than it already has in the northern part of the Hudson, we see in our model that it raises the flood height. You have a stronger slope to the flood, and there's a higher flood level in Albany. So we definitely see that. In the back?
Yeah, I guess in full disclosure, I worked on that SIRR in the sewage treatment plant and the pumping stations for the city of New York, part of our project. And they did do comparatively well. They have a lot of what they're doing now is incorporating into their design standards these types of things. So they used to, for example, allow the electricians to run conduits as they saw fit according to the normal trade practice. Now they found that most of the flooding, or a lot of the flooding anyway, occurs in conduits, penetrations in the walls, things that need to change the way they're doing the designs.
Great.
Whereas out at Bay Park, they're building a wall.
Yeah.
And the thing about what you maybe think of this with this channel deepening is that sometimes you don't realize that if you build a wall, you have to be able to get the water out, and you have to, in most cases, you have to put in a pumping station.
Yeah.
The size of these dewatering pumping stations are just unbelievable. They're some of the largest in the world, and for Bay Park, as an example, we're working as well. The challenge is that these pumping stations don't run. You have to exercise them routinely because they're for a 1 in 500 year event where it fails or something goes wrong. You have to maintain this giant pumping station that's almost never run, and that becomes incredibly cost prohibitive. And unless you have a very narrow set of circumstances, putting a wall around, putting a barrier around something like that, that has to be.
You got to build it so high it'll never overtop.
Right.
Maybe is the best solution, but that's expensive too.
Sewage treatment plants are hydraulically connected to the water.
Oh, yeah.
So the water
Right.
comes right at the outfall and floods everything.
Yeah.
And Bay Park has an effluent pumping station because it was built at a low level already, so it has to pump its wastewater out during periods of high tide already. So that made it convenient for us to talk about a wall because they already have to pump. It's already there, and it works. But they still have a separate pumping station they have to build to keep the facility grounded. So that's a big challenge on the local site level.
Yeah.
Type of resilience.
Yep.
So,
Michael Morello.
you have evidence that shows that the flood heights have increased in New York, New Jersey Harbor since the mid-1800s rather significantly. Have you compared that to other locations in the North Atlantic to see if they have had similar increases?
That's in our NSF proposal. So, and would involve scanning data from other harbors like Philadelphia, Boston. I think we're looking all the way down to Norfolk and places like that. And it's a really good question. Do we see the same thing in many locations? And that might mean it's more likely to be a climate, or if they're all different locations that have had different exposure to the open ocean and different dredging history. So that's one thing we really want to do, is to look more regionally at all the different locations and see if storm tides are increasing also.
Can I just ask a quick question about that? Because I'm not
Sure.
sure I understand it. So we know the sea level has risen, but are you saying there's another factor? You have those two charts, but I didn't
Yep.
quite understand how you got the data on the one that was not the sea level, was the other.
Yeah. So storm tide is just the water level above mean sea level for that year. So every year we take out the mean sea level so that we get rid of the sea level rise.
Oh.
And then it's the wind and pressure driven, like I showed with the model, the wind and pressure driven water and tide driven water level alone with no mean sea level. So back in 1821, the sea level was 1.5 feet lower. We eliminate that change from it. So the storm tides have grown by 28, the 10-year storm tide, 10-year event, has grown by 28 centimeters since the mid-1800s. Sea level rise has come up by 44 centimeters. So in total, we have 72 centimeter higher 10-year flood height. So that's 2.5 feet worse than in the 1800s. Big difference. So, if you look at the old pilings for piers, I don't know if this is true, but they're a lot lower than the newer piers along our waterfronts. And I don't know if that's because they've been eaten away at by the bugs, but, the waterfront infrastructure has come up. We've actually adapted to sea level rise to some extent already. We've had 1.5 feet of it, so there's been a very slow adaptation. The real danger is if we start having a much more rapid rate of sea level rise. Go ahead.
So if you look at the record of infrastructure projects in the New York region, it's driven in part by economics, and there's opportunity and political factors. It's not a very rational development.
Mm-hmm.
And so the idea of designing a better future to create a more resilient harbor is very challenging to me, because I don't know how that's going to be affected politically or economically. And do you relate to that kind of thinking too? I mean, are there people at the Stevens Institute or economists who are looking at public policy and the intersection of science and public policy in that way?
Yeah, it's an interesting question, about how do we plan for adaptation when it comes in spurts, right? And Sandy is one of the spurts, and we're going to have a bunch of, my feeling is we're going to have a aggressive response probably to sea level rise and 500-year floods like Hurricane Sandy all at once, and that may or may not be good. I'm a little more concerned that things are going to be done in a hurry when we don't understand why storm tides are getting worse. We don't understand sea level rise. It could be 10 inches, or it could be 1 to 6 feet within this century. And we have satellites measuring it that are going to give us a lot better knowledge in the next 10 or 20 years. So I'm a little worried that we're going to rush to take advantage of this spurt, and that's a real tough question. Do we want to quickly capitalize on the billions of dollars coming down the pipe, or it'd be nice if we could invest more money. One idea I have is that it would be nice to invest $1 billion right now in a buyout fund that's there immediately next time there's a terrible flood somewhere where it's a dangerous neighborhood, so that people aren't, a year and a half later, like now, still waiting to learn if they're going to get a buyout, in a few of these neighborhoods that want to actually move. So having some of those billions of dollars go into a fund might be a good solution, instead of a rushed, hurry up and build kind of mindset, which I think is what our senators and politicians have right now, because the political timescale that exists. It's something that's really important to think about, and we need to get more minds on it. Is how do you plan it for the long term? It's hard for an ocean modeler to model how. It's the kind of thing I'd like to do, is simulate how society might react to all these random events over time, and that's kind of what happened in New Orleans. Every time they had a higher flood, they raised their defenses by another foot above the flood. I mean, literally, this is what happened over hundreds of years, and that's my concern, is that we find ourselves, once New Orleans it sinks, and they have sea level rise. So that's why they're at the forefront of this problem. Their cities 10 feet below in many places their protection. But if we all have a meter of sea level rise coming, by the end of this century, a meter of sea level rise, meters of sea level rise at a rapid rate, then we're going to be like New Orleans. So we got to think ahead 100 years and think, well, what's it going to look like if we have one strategy, a strategy of raising protections always and not raising neighborhoods? And that's something we need to think ahead
I
about.
think you need all the strategies, quite frankly.
Yeah.
If you believe the climate change forecast and don't see a way, to really stop a lot of it, it seems to me you need every strategy. You need the localized strategies. If you do have a big flood area, you don't keep it closed. You close it. You don't try not to close it. So some storms you would have to then rely on the local. But if a big storm comes, what I've heard is that the damages from Isaac, the whole project in New Orleans cost about $14 billion, which Congress gave to the Corps of Engineers, and they rebuilt, lots and lots of miles of levees and seawalls, and then the largest storm surge barrier in the world and the largest pumping station in the world. And that cost, that if it hadn't been there, Isaac would have paid for itself.
Yeah.
And
the first thing you're talking about is layered solutions, which is a real good idea that you're hearing more and more, is to have multiple layers. And it can be a storm surge barrier. It can be people understanding the water, like I said earlier, understanding tides or knowing how to swim more, having more. You can have all these layers of protection. And it's a much better thing than having just one strategy. So that's
and
true.
if we have to retreat, which we might well have to do.
Another strategy.
If you have protection there that's going to protect you, if you start seeing as the sea level keeps going up, well, we really are going to have to retreat or totally, do things differently, then, that can act as protection while if you realize that you're going to have to do that. There's so much uncertainty, and yet it seems to me that the evidence is that the sea level is going to rise quite a bit more in the next 50 years or 100 years, regardless of what we do, right? To stop the costs.
Yeah. Why don't we do one more?
I've asked one already.
Go ahead.
Okay. So the governor's office in New Jersey has contracted with 6 state universities in New Jersey. I can't remember if it's one to look at resiliency measures. There's not a lot of transparency about what those projects are. Can you shed any light on that initiative or what might be coming out?
Yeah, so Stevens has a few projects, one on Barnegat Bay, one on the Hudson shorefront of New Jersey, being from Bayonne to Weehawken, Hoboken, Jersey City. I'm not involved in either project deeply, but they're both, and there is some secretiveness, I think, with the governor's office is kind of trying to control things a little bit, instead of results being shown completely openly. So, but I can't really speak to too many details. I can say that what we're doing at Stevens is it's model studies that just have a local grid. Actually, one of them's in here. Can we switch? No, it's all right. We have a 6-meter grid of Hoboken. We have a 6-meter model grid of Hoboken, and now we've made one all the way down from Weehawken to Bayonne that resolves water down streets. So the buildings are in there. Unlike these models that I've shown here, they're bare earth, and they're done to buildings versus streets. So we're looking at really detailed modeling, and where the floodwaters came into Hoboken from the north and south, can you put in protection? So both those studies are about understanding exactly what happened with Sandy, and then trying to see better how, from knowing what happened, where the floodwater came in, how you can stop it or reduce it.
Okay. Well, thanks. I think we've warmed up. Terrific. Learned a lot. I want to know more about persistent organic contaminants and the Passaic River. Be here next month. Actually, it's May 6th to hear Rainer Lohman of University of Rhode Island. Going to talk about his work that we've been funding the last several years in Passaic. So thanks for coming. See you next month.
In preparation.
Yes. Can I get a copy? What is the
separate. Yeah. Why don't I send you a copy when it's got the right print?
Yeah, that'd be fine.
Thanks for coming.
Yeah, awesome. Great.
So I want to know more about Staten Island. What did they raise the bar in 19?